She thought it was just another carefree TikTok dance, until a K9 German Shepherd slammed into her and pointed straight at the river. Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. Confusion tangled with fear as Mia struggled to sit up, her heart pounding like a drumline against her ribs. The shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, his stance as solid as a statue carved from duty itself. His deep brown eyes locked on something beyond the rippling surface of the water. Mia's chest tightened, a sickening twist of dread coiling in her stomach. She followed his unwavering gaze, her vision cutting through the golden shimmer of sunlight dancing on the current. And then she saw it. A fleeting flash of pink against the dull greens of the riverbank reeds. Her mind scrambled to make sense of it, but the realization hit her like a gut punch. It was a tiny shoe, impossibly small, half submerged and drifting toward the deeper waters. Time seemed to fracture as the dog let out a sharp, commanding bark that echoed across the empty clearing like a shot fired in warning. And then he moved. With a grace that defied his size, the shepherd sprinted toward the bank, muscles rippling beneath his sleek coat, and without hesitation, he launched into the water. Mia's instincts screamed at her to move, but her body lagged behind the rising panic in her mind. She stumbled to her feet, shoes slipping against the dew-slick grass as she ran after him, the cool air slicing against her flushed skin. The water ahead roiled and frothed as the dog fought the current, his head barely above the choppy surface, his eyes fixed on something Mia couldn't yet see. And then it happened. A small, pale hand broke through the water, reaching toward the sky before disappearing beneath the surface again. Mia's lungs seized, her pulse roaring in her ears like a crashing waterfall. Without a second thought, she tore off her shoes, barely registering the sharp sting of pebbles beneath her bare feet, and dove into the icy grip of the river. The cold was a brutal slap against her senses, stealing her breath as the current dragged at her legs like unseen chains. Her arms strained against the pull of the water, her eyes frantically scanning for any sign of the little girl and the dog. Just when her muscles screamed that they couldn't go another inch, the shepherd broke the surface ahead of her. His powerful jaws clenched around a small arm, his legs paddling furiously toward the shore. Mia pushed through the exhaustion, her fingers clawing through the water to reach them as the child's limp form was pulled toward the safety of the shallows. She collapsed beside them on the muddy bank, gasping for air, her chest heaving with sobs and relief. The little girl was deathly pale, her tiny frame motionless, her lips tinged an ominous shade of blue. Mia pressed trembling fingers to the child's wrist and felt nothing. A raw scream built in her throat, but before despair could swallow her whole, the shepherd leaned close, his warm breath brushing against Mia's face, his intense eyes locked on hers as if willing her to fight, to try, to save. And in that moment, with the weight of two lives hanging in the balance, Mia knew she had no choice but to fight with everything she had. Mia's breath hitched, the air around her suddenly feeling too thick, too heavy to pull into her lungs. Her mind spun in 1,000 directions at once, but her eyes remained locked on that tiny, heart-wrenching flash of pink. It swayed gently with the current as if the river itself held its breath, a silent witness to something unspeakable just beneath its surface. The shepherd's ears flicked back, his muscles tensed, and in that haunting stillness, Mia could almost feel the unspoken urgency radiating off him. He wasn't just pointing. He was pleading, begging her to see what he already knew. Her legs felt numb, her hands trembling so violently she could barely steady herself against the earth as she crawled forward for a better view. The reeds rustled softly, their tall blades parting just enough for her to see the impossible. A small, pale hand breaking the surface before vanishing again like a cruel trick of the light. Mia's stomach turned to ice, her mind screaming at her to move, to do something, but her body refused to obey, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what she was witnessing. The shepherd let out a low, guttural whine, and it broke through her paralysis like a thunderclap. Before she could gather her senses, the dog lunged forward, his powerful frame cutting through the tall grass and diving headfirst into the river with a splash that seemed to snap the entire world back into motion. Mia stumbled to her feet, nearly tripping over her own legs as she sprinted after him, her eyes darting between the churning waters and the reeds where that tiny hand had appeared. The current was stronger than it looked, and the shepherd fought it with everything he had, his. Head held high, his jaws set with grim determination as he pushed through the swirling water. Mia reached the riverbank just in time to see his powerful form disappear beneath the surface, and a strangled sob escaped her lips. She scanned the water frantically, searching for any sign of him, of the child, of anything but the merciless pull of the river. Her heart thundered in her ears, drowning out the rush of the current and the pounding of her own panicked footsteps along the slippery edge. Then, in a moment so fragile it felt like the world itself might shatter under its weight, the shepherd broke the surface, his jaws gently gripping a small, lifeless arm. The little girl's body floated limply as the dog kicked furiously toward the shore, his every movement a battle against the current's relentless pull. Mia tore off her shoes, barely aware of the sharp stones biting into her feet, and plunged into the freezing water, her mind consumed by a single, desperate thought. Don't let her slip away. The cold was a brutal shock, stealing her breath and numbing her limbs. But she fought through it, arms slicing through the icy water, legs kicking with every ounce of strength she had left. She reached them as the shepherd dragged the girl into the shallows, his eyes meeting Mia's with a look so fierce, so full of raw urgency, it burned hotter than any words could. Collapsing onto the muddy bank beside them, Mia reached for the girl, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she pressed her fingers to the child's neck, her own pulse thundering so loud she wasn't sure she could even feel for another. And in that moment, as the shepherd stood over them like a silent sentinel, Mia realized this wasn't just a plea for help. It was a test of everything she had left to give. Mia's heart slammed against her ribs so violently it felt like it might crack her chest open as she stumbled toward the riverbank, her vision tunneling in on that single, horrifying image. The tiny hand swallowed by the water as quickly as it had appeared. The shepherd had already vanished beneath the surface, his powerful body cutting through the current like a torpedo on a mission. But the cold, brutal reality of what she'd just witnessed held her rooted in place for a heartbeat too long. The river seemed to pulse with menace, the soft lapping of the water against the rocks a cruel whisper in her ears as panic clawed at her throat, choking out every logical thought. The world narrowed to the chaos of the moment, the frantic splashing ahead, the sickening rush of icy water curling around her bare ankles as she stepped in without even realizing it, and the terrifying absence of that small, fragile hand. Her mind flashed through every worst-case scenario in the space of a single breath, each one darker and more unbearable than the last. But then the shepherd's head broke the surface, his powerful jaws clenched around a small, limp arm, his eyes wild with determination as he fought the savage pull of the river. Mia's paralysis shattered, her instincts taking over in a tidal wave of adrenaline as she lunged forward into the frigid current. The shock of the water hit her like a punch to the lungs, stealing her breath and turning her muscles to stone. But she forced her legs to move, kicking against the current, her arms slicing through the water as she closed the agonizing distance between herself and the shepherd. Every stroke felt like a battle against the river's unforgiving grip. Every second stretched into eternity as the child's lifeless form bobbed in and out of the water, her delicate features pale against the dark swirl of the current. Mia pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming, until her fingers finally brushed against the shepherd's soaked fur. Together they fought their way toward the shore, the dog's powerful legs never faltering despite the weight he carried. Mia grasped the child's tiny body, her heart breaking at the unnatural stillness of it, her mind refusing to accept what her senses were screaming. With a final desperate surge, she dragged the girl onto the muddy riverbank, collapsing beside her in a heap of exhaustion and raw fear. Her hands moved on instinct, pressing against the child's chest, her own tears falling freely as she counted out compressions, her voice cracking with every whispered plea for the little girl to breathe. The shepherd stood guard at her side, his soaked coat dripping onto the earth, his eyes locked on the scene with an intensity that felt almost human. And as Mia pressed her trembling lips to the girl's blue-tinged mouth, fighting through the cold and the terror and the creeping weight of hopelessness, she felt the shepherd's silent presence beside her like a promise, one that refused to give up, no matter how dark the moment seemed. The icy water wrapped around Mia like 1,000 needles stabbing into her skin, each stroke against the current feeling more impossible than the last. But she refused to stop, refused to let that tiny arm be the last thing she ever saw of the girl. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Her breath came in ragged gasps that felt like fire tearing through frozen lungs. But she pushed forward, her eyes straining through the chaotic dance of water and light, desperately searching for any sign of the shepherd. The river roared in her ears, a deafening symphony of rushing water and her own pounding heartbeat, drowning out every rational thought except for one: reach them before it's too late. Her fingers clawed through the water, numb and clumsy, her legs burning with exhaustion as the current pulled her further from the shore. Just when her vision started to blur and her strength faltered, a flash of dark fur broke through the surface ahead of her, and there he was, the shepherd, his powerful jaws gripping the small, fragile arm of the girl, his eyes locked forward with an unshakable resolve as he fought toward the riverbank. Relief slammed into Mia with such force it stole what little breath she had left, but she didn't waste a second. Summoning everything she had, she lunged through the water, her hands reaching for the child as the shepherd kicked harder, the muscles beneath his slick, soaked fur working like a machine built for nothing but rescue. The child's head lolled back against the water, her face pale as porcelain, lips a haunting shade of blue that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over Mia. She couldn't feel anything but the cold and the unbearable weight of panic threatening to drown her before the river ever could. But the shepherd didn't slow, didn't falter, and with one final heroic surge, he propelled himself and the child toward the shallow edge of the bank. Mia scrambled to find footing, her knees scraping against sharp rocks hidden beneath the muddy water as she pulled the girl onto the shore, her own body collapsing beside her in the wet earth, gasping for air that felt just as sharp and cold as the water she'd escaped. Her shaking hands pressed against the girl's tiny chest, her fingers fumbling for a pulse she couldn't find, her mind screaming in denial against the creeping realization that they might be too late. The shepherd stood vigil beside them, his soaked body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes never leaving the girl's face, his entire being coiled tight with an urgency that felt almost sacred. Mia blinked away the blur of tears, her voice a broken whisper as she counted out compressions, each desperate breath she gave the girl feeling like a battle against the impossible. And in that fragile, suspended moment between life and loss, Mia realized this wasn't just a fight against the river. It was a fight against fate itself, and she refused to lose. Mia's hands trembled as she pressed down on the little girl's chest, her mind running on a frantic loop of whispered prayers and half-remembered training, each compression a silent plea against the crushing weight of reality. The girl's tiny frame barely moved under the force of her hands, and with every count, the silence grew heavier, more suffocating, threatening to pull Mia under just like the river had moments before. Her tears blurred her vision, hot streaks cutting through the cold numbness on her cheeks. But she refused to look away, refused to stop even as her arms ached and her chest tightened with helplessness. The shepherd stood just beside them, his soaked fur dripping onto the earth, his ears pinned back and his eyes locked on Mia with a focus so intense it felt like a command. Don't give up. Don't you dare give up. Mia tilted the girl's head back, her own lips shaking as she sealed them over the child's and breathed life into lungs that seemed far too small, far too still. She pulled back, watching, waiting, counting the seconds that felt like eternities, her heart hammering in her ears louder than the rushing river behind her. Nothing. Panic clawed at her throat, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as she fought against the rising tide of hopelessness. She pressed her trembling fingers to the girl's neck again, desperate for even the faintest flicker of a pulse. Still nothing. A sob broke free, raw and aching, but she swallowed it down, biting hard on her lip until she tasted blood, forcing herself to keep going. Another set of compressions, another desperate breath, another silent plea screamed into the uncaring sky. The shepherd leaned closer, his dark eyes shimmering with something that felt almost like grief, his body tense and unmoving as if he knew that his mission wasn't done. Not until this little life sparked back to existence. And then, just when Mia felt her strength give way, just when her hands faltered and the darkness of failure crept in, the girl coughed. It was small, barely more than a shuddering gasp, but it was enough. Mia froze for a heartbeat before instinct took over again, gently turning the child onto her side as a thin stream of river water spilled from her tiny mouth. The girl's chest rose with a shallow, rattling breath, and her lashes fluttered weakly against pale cheeks. Relief so sharp it felt like pain washed through Mia, her hands trembling as she brushed the sodden hair from the girl's forehead. She sobbed openly now, unable to hold it back, the sound raw and broken as the shepherd finally sat back, his head lifting toward the horizon as if offering a silent thanks to something higher. The girl whimpered softly, her small fingers curling into the mud beside her, and Mia clutched those fingers in her own, holding them tight like a lifeline to hope. And in that moment, soaked to the bone, trembling with exhaustion and overwhelming relief, Mia realized she had just witnessed a miracle born from sheer will, unwavering loyalty, and the kind of courage that lives in the hearts of heroes, both human and canine. The sound of that fragile, broken gasp shattered the unbearable silence like a thunderclap, and for a heartbeat, Mia couldn't believe her ears. The little girl's chest rose and fell in shallow, stuttering breaths before another cough racked her tiny frame, a desperate, shuddering cry ripping from her throat as the river water poured from her lungs. That sound, raw, terrified, alive, was the most beautiful thing Mia had ever heard, and it broke her completely. Her knees buckled, hitting the muddy ground with a dull thud as she let the sobs pour out, her tears mixing with the damp earth beneath her trembling hands. She reached for the girl, brushing back soaked strands of golden hair from the child's pale forehead, whispering words she couldn't even hear over the pounding in her ears, her hands cradling that tiny face as if afraid it might vanish if she let go. The shepherd lowered himself to the ground beside them, his broad chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. A deep rumble of satisfaction vibrating through his throat as he watched the girl cling to life. His dark eyes never wavered, locked onto the child as if silently vowing to stand guard until he was certain she was safe, his mission etched into every line of his powerful, exhausted body. The girl whimpered, her small fingers clutching weakly at Mia's sleeve, her eyes fluttering open for just a moment, hazy and unfocused, before sliding closed again. Panic threatened to rise again in Mia's chest, but she forced herself to breathe, to remember that this was the body's way of recovering, that the fight wasn't over, but the hardest part had been won. In the distance, faint but growing louder with every second, came the wail of sirens cutting through the air, a lifeline rushing toward them through the chaos. Mia let her head fall back, her eyes closing as the weight of everything crashed down around her. Fear, relief, exhaustion, gratitude so profound it felt like her heart might burst from the force of it. She pressed her forehead gently against the girl's, whispering, "Hold on, sweetheart. Help's coming. Just hold on, sa." The shepherd shifted beside her, his head lifting toward the sound of approaching salvation, his ears twitching as if assessing every detail of their surroundings, his duty far from over. Even in that moment of tentative peace, his instincts never faltered, his loyalty unwavering. Mia reached out with a shaking hand and pressed it gently against his massive shoulder, her voice cracking as she whispered, "You did it. You saved her." The shepherd turned his head just slightly, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that needed no words. And in that look was a history she couldn't yet understand. A story of loss and loyalty, and a promise kept long after hope should have faded. And as the flashing lights crested the hill and the world rushed back into frantic motion, Mia knew that this day had changed everything. Not just for the little girl gasping for life in her arms, but for herself and the silent hero who had led her through the darkest waters and back into the light. The name hung in the air like a sacred echo, and for a moment, the chaos around them seemed to blur into the background as Mia stared at the shepherd, her mind racing to make sense of what she'd just heard. Coda. The name seemed to settle over him like an invisible mantle, one he wore with the quiet dignity of a soldier who had never truly stood down. His powerful frame remained still, his wet coat glistening under the flashing red and blue lights, but his eyes never stopped searching the horizon, scanning the distance with the kind of focus only a heart that refused to forget could possess. Paramedics worked feverishly behind them, their voices low but urgent as they stabilized the little girl and carried her toward the waiting ambulance, her tiny hand clutching weakly at the oxygen mask before slipping into unconsciousness again. Mia felt a sob threaten her throat, but she swallowed it back, her gaze locked on Coda, wondering how a creature so loyal, so brave, could have survived all this time alone. The officer stepped closer, his voice hoarse with disbelief as he knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on Coda's broad shoulder. "He disappeared the day Daniels. The day we lost him in that flood. No one's seen him since. We searched for weeks, thought he was gone for good, but here he is, still doing his job like he never stopped being a part of this force." His voice cracked with the weight of it, and Mia felt her heart squeeze painfully against her ribs as she reached out, her trembling hand finding its way to Coda's thick, damp fur. Coda didn't flinch at the touch, didn't turn his head or pull away. He simply sat there, regal and unyielding, his eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like looking into the very soul of loss itself. Mia couldn't stop the tears from falling this time, her fingers curling gently into the damp warmth of his fur as the realization hit her full force. This dog had been alone for weeks, wandering, waiting, surviving against every odd, his heart tethered to a partner who would never return. And yet, even through his own grief, he had answered a call for help no one else could have heard. He had found that little girl when no one else even knew she was lost. He had fulfilled his duty, not out of obligation, but out of love for a promise he'd made long ago. The paramedics waved from the ambulance, signaling that it was time to go. But Mia stayed crouched beside Coda for a moment longer, her voice soft and broken as she whispered, "You're not alone anymore, Coda. Not now." And as the sirens wailed and the ambulance pulled away into the fading light, Coda stood and gave one final look to the horizon before turning his weary eyes back to Mia. As if in that moment, he understood that maybe, just maybe, his mission wasn't over yet after all. The glow of Mia's phone screen cast eerie shadows across her bedroom walls as she lay curled under the thin comforter, her mind too restless, her heart too heavy to surrender to sleep. Every search result she pulled up felt like peeling back the layers of a story too painful to comprehend, yet too powerful to turn away from. Image after image of Officer Daniels and Coda filled her screen, the bond between them captured in every candid photo. Daniels kneeling beside Coda with a proud, easy smile, Coda sitting tall and alert, his amber eyes always watching, always waiting for the next command. They were legends in their precinct, a duo known for bravery that pushed them into situations others might have hesitated to enter. Flood rescues, building collapses, even dangerous criminal takedowns. Together, they had saved lives without hesitation. Coda always by Daniel's side, a silent, fearless guardian. But then came that one terrible day, the flood that swept through the lowlands faster than anyone could predict. Reports detailed how Officer Daniels had gone in after a stranded family trapped by rising waters, Coda by his side as always. Witnesses said Daniels managed to lift the last child onto a rescue boat, his arms trembling with exhaustion, his uniform soaked and heavy. But before he could climb aboard, the current surged with a deadly force, pulling him under. In the chaos, Coda had leapt in after him, but neither were seen again. Until today. Mia wiped at her cheeks, not even realizing when the tears had started falling. Her chest tight with the weight of grief for a man she never knew and the loyal heart of a dog who refused to forget. She scrolled further, finding forum posts and heartfelt messages from fellow officers, stories about how Coda hadn't just been a service dog. He had been family, a hero with instincts that defied logic. A creature with a heart so loyal it seemed almost human. And when Daniels was lost, Coda had vanished into the wilderness as if his own soul had broken that day, unable to return to a world without his partner. But instead of surrendering to that grief, Coda had kept searching, kept waiting by those waters as if believing, against all odds, that Daniels might somehow return. Mia's thoughts spiraled through the impossible timeline, realizing Coda must have survived on his own for weeks, driven by nothing but that bond, that unwavering sense of duty forged in moments of life and death. And even though he had lost everything, he hadn't stopped being a protector. Today was proof of that. Exhausted, Mia sat up and walked to the window, staring out into the moonlit night where the river glimmered in the distance like a silver thread winding through the darkness. Somewhere out there, not long ago, Coda had been standing alone by those waters, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for a partner who would never come home. And somehow, that silent, heartbreaking vigil had led him to the girl in time to save her life. Mia pressed her hand to the cool glass and whispered into the quiet, "You kept your promise, Coda. And now, it's our turn to take care of Yao." The morning sun cast a soft golden light across the dewy grass as Mia opened her front door. And there he was, Coda, sitting perfectly still at the top of her porch steps, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, his eyes calm but carrying the weight of a sorrow far too deep for words. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the silence between them more powerful than any greeting could ever be. Mia's heart clenched as she stepped barefoot onto the cool wood, lowering herself to her knees until she was eye level with him. Gently, she reached out and placed her trembling hand against his thick fur, her forehead pressing against his in a moment of quiet understanding that seemed to stretch far beyond the limits of language. "You're not lost anymore," she whispered, her breath warming the space between them as a tear slipped free and landed in his fur. Coda closed his eyes for a brief second, as if accepting her words but unable to fully believe them yet. His body relaxed, but his spirit still caught somewhere between loyalty and loss. By that afternoon, with the police department's blessing and the paperwork finalized with hands that shook from the enormity of it all, Coda officially had a new home, but it was clear his heart still belonged to the horizon. Each day, without fail, he would rise before the sun and make his way down the familiar path to the riverbank, his steps slow and measured, his eyes forever scanning the distance as if he might spot the silhouette of a man he had once followed into every storm. Mia tried everything to ease his burden. New toys, long walks, soft blankets laid out beside the warm hearth, but nothing seemed to pull him entirely from the quiet vigil he kept by the water's edge. She would sit with him sometimes, her legs pulled to her chest, watching the way his eyes never stopped searching, how his ears twitched at every shift in the wind, how his powerful frame remained poised as if ready to spring into action the moment his name was called. And even in his stillness, there was a grace to him, a noble kind of grief that seemed to paint him in the colors of a warrior who had never quite left the battlefield. But in the quiet moments, when the sky turned from gold to the soft blush of evening and the river became a ribbon of light beneath the fading sun, he would return home to her side. He would rest his heavy head on her lap, his eyes closing as she stroked his ears and whispered stories about new beginnings and second chances. And though he never truly stopped waiting, Mia could feel it. Little by little, he was starting to understand that even a heart as loyal and broken as his could find a new place to belong. And maybe, just maybe, the horizon he searched for wasn't out there anymore. It was right beside him, in the warmth of a stranger who had become his shelter from the storm. The morning of the memorial arrived cloaked in a soft mist that curled low over the river like a veil between this world and the next. The air thick with remembrance and the weight of unspoken goodbyes. Mia stood quietly beside Coda as people gathered along the riverbank, their uniforms crisp, their faces drawn with the solemnity of those who had loved and lost. The flags fluttered gently in the breeze, and the steady murmur of the flowing water felt like a heartbeat beneath the silence. Coda sat at the very front, his broad frame motionless, his head held high beneath the gleaming badge affixed to his freshly fitted service vest. The gold insignia glinted faintly against the dark fabric, a symbol of honor bestowed upon him by the very department that had once called him their own. But today, that badge wasn't just a mark of service. It was a tribute to the partner he'd never stopped waiting for, the one whose memory still echoed in every careful step, every watchful glance toward the horizon. The ceremony began. Voices hushed as names were read and memories shared, but through it all, Coda remained still as stone, his eyes fixed not on the speakers, but on the endless stretch of water before him. And when the final words were spoken, when the bugle's mournful cry lifted into the sky and the sharp crack of the last salute echoed across the river, Coda stood. With the grace of a soldier who had never forgotten his post, he turned to face the horizon where the mist hung thickest, where the water seemed to stretch into forever, and with deliberate, unwavering purpose, he lifted his right paw and pointed toward that unseen distance. A collective breath seemed to catch in every chest along the shore, a moment so raw and profound it felt as if time itself had knelt before the loyalty of this silent warrior. And in that singular, breathtaking gesture, Coda gave his final salute, not just to his fallen partner, but to every soul who had ever stood a post and never returned. Mia felt her throat tighten as she pressed a trembling hand over her heart, her vision blurring with tears she didn't try to hide. She realized then that this wasn't the end of Coda's story. It was the closing of a chapter written in sacrifice, in unwavering devotion, and in the kind of love that never truly lets go. As the sun broke through the clouds and cast a brilliant beam of light across the water, Coda lowered his paw, turned back toward Mia, and walked to her side, his head leaning gently against her hip as if to say, "It's done now." And in that moment, she knew she hadn't just witnessed a story meant for viral fame. She had stood in the presence of a legend, a living testament to the bonds that even death could not sever, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who remain steadfast when all others have fallen.